While we have our own crisis and tragedies to witness in our own country, but there is a lot going on in the subcontinent, particularly in Sri Lanka, that we have also been following quite closely. While the mainstream media covers the turmoil in Sri Lanka is something that is unfolding on a day-to-day basis that we read in the papers, what we feel gets lost out in is the long-term trajectories that has precipitated the crisis. Now, for instance, the Kerala finance minister said that the economic crisis in Sri Lanka is a result of its aggressive globalization and ill-conceived borrowing policy. The Lankan crisis, in fact, seems to be a case study of what exactly breeds under a regime of reckless consumption promoted by global MNCs, IMF, and the World Bank. It also highlights the perils of a complete reliance on the market, as it is the public sector that comes handy in moments of crisis, as it did for India during the 2008 meltdown. So while the immediate reasons certainly lie in the pandemic affecting its tourism sector or the more recent Ukrainian war, the crisis was long in the making. It can be traced back to the IMF diktats that made it more dependent on foreign aid, while it cut down on subsidies, wages, and social sector spending. And much like India after liberalization in the 1990s, that needed an enemy, in this case Muslims, to distract the people from the consequent hardships, they whipped up the Sinhala chauvinism against the Tamils. Also, a thwarting of democracy by projecting a strongman image who takes overnight decisions is a tendency that is clear across the borders, and which has also contributed in throwing Sri Lanka into the dire straits to a certain extent. Now, while the dimensions of the island nation and India are vastly different, even then there are lessons to be drawn for India from these undercurrents and the ramifications for the people is a question that we would explore. Also, are there any lessons to be drawn from the over-reliance of indirect taxes instead of taxing the top? There are very many things that we need to explore and probably learn from as the crisis unfolds, even for ourselves. We feel the panel today, moderated by Neera Chandhoke, would throw light on several of these aspects and more. Just to introduce the moderator as well as the panelists, Neera Chandhoke is a distinguished fellow at the Center for Equity Studies and former professor of political science in the Delhi University. Among other things, from the lens of political theory, she has written extensively on state and the civil society. Howard Nicholas is visiting lecturer in National Institute for Social Sciences, Erasmus University, Rotterdam. He has extensively studied and followed the economic trajectory of Sri Lanka and will bring in his insights about the crisis. And finally, Professor Ramakumar from the School of Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. He has been writing about the Lankan crisis and has been contextualizing it within the broader trajectories. He can also throw some light on what it means for India and if there are any learnings for us.
Thank you, Anirban. I think we should start.
Thank you very much. One immediate thing, I'm a Sri Lankan, even though I don't look like it. I'm from what is called the Burgher community. We have European descent. I think you have similar people in Goa, isn't it? Something also from European descent. One thing that I did, which is of some relevance, is I helped set up the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka, which is a think tank for the government. And that brought me close to government policy making. So I had a bit more of an insight into government policy than usually is the case for academics. I've been here now about 6 weeks in Sri Lanka and talking with people in the business community, also professionals. And this morning I was addressing trade union leaders and people from the left, so from the Communist Party, from our Lanka Samasavaj Party, etc. And bizarrely, I gave exactly the same presentation to everyone, business community, also to the labor leaders, and also to the left political parties. And basically, the argument that I've been developing with everyone is that the IMF policies that are being promoted at the moment in Sri Lanka are essentially treating the symptoms and not the cause. The interesting thing is, for the first time in my memory, and also for most other people, so the older generation, we can't remember an occasion where the IMF was so popular in Sri Lanka. So you have tricycle drivers, you have young people, all with placards demanding that the IMF is brought in. So obviously this is for Sri Lanka a huge sea change. And I've been on a number of television programs where I've been interrogated by the interviewer and saying, oh, we've been led to believe that you're against the IMF. And, this is not in keeping with the rest of the population. And that's probably true to some extent, but let me just give you my line of argumentation in summary so that when you eventually cut me off, Neera, then I've already told you my story. The first thing is that, so my basic line is that the IMF policies are treating the symptoms, not the cause. One thing is, and that's very important for me, is that the IMF ignores the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is our continuous trade deficit. Irrespective of what we have done with fiscal policy, we've maintained a continuous trade deficit of in the area of 10 to 11%. That has been going on for more than 30 years in Sri Lanka. And then the second thing that I want to develop very briefly is the policies that are being recommended. My argument is that because the IMF policies are treating the symptoms and not the cause, we will not eradicate this fundamental problem that we have had, which is this continuous large trade deficit, which makes us vulnerable to any shock in the global system. That's why we have been to the IMF 16 times since the Second World War, 16 times. And my worry is that the policies that they're likely to recommend this time round will actually make the situation worse. Because one of those policies that they're likely to recommend is that we increase our exposure to international sovereign bond debt. So that's my second major theme that I want to develop, time permitting, but now you know the basic argument that I want to develop. Okay, so this is our current situation, that essentially all our reserves will go on servicing the foreign debt. We're at a position that nearly 100% of all our reserves will go just on servicing foreign debt. And this means to say that we will have very little, if anything, left over to buy imports. Now, obviously, it has an important consequence for our international credit rating. And this is where we are at the moment here, down here. Let me just get my laser pointer. So we're here at the moment. In other words, we were in junk bond, but very recently we've gone actually into default because the government has said that we are not able to honor our foreign debt obligations. So we're effectively in default, which is why we are now with the IMF. One thing that the Sri Lankan government did already a couple of years ago, they started import controls. Without these import controls, the end would have been much earlier. We would have essentially had no foreign exchange left to continue importing anything. So this is where we are. It's a huge saving. In fact, it's an $8 billion saving. But this is not sustainable because it's damaging business in Sri Lanka. It's damaging, as you know, we have power cuts because there's not enough diesel to run the generators. What I want to show is I've got one One slide showing the IMF basically comes along and tells us your current account problems and your trade problems are fundamentally due to the budget deficit, and the budget deficit leading to money printing. Okay, so this is the standard textbook approach, and that there is this large budget deficit which has to be funded by money printing. Okay, so it's the standard thing, and that we need the government to bring the IMF in to discipline them, because if they don't do that, we will have these recurrent problems. Now, from my perspective, what has been completely missed is this large trade balance. And it's not just Sri Lanka, but my son has done a study of 162 developing countries. He splits them into industrializing developing countries and non-industrializing developing countries. Export-oriented industrializing and non-export-oriented industrializing. And what he shows is that the average current account balance for industrializing developing countries is 3% of GDP over a 35-year period, the average. They never actually dip into negative territory. They're always in positive territory. The non-industrializing developing countries are always in negative territory. Their current account balances are always negative. They compensate, for example, in Sri Lanka's case, we compensate through migrant remittances and tourism. These are our two major earning sources which compensate for a very large trade imbalance, amounting to about 10% of GDP, currently actually at 11%. The difference, because this isn't entirely compensating for this negative balance, the difference is acquired by borrowing. So we borrow. Usually this has in the past been bilateral loans. So we have India, Japan, and China are three main donors, each one accounting for about 10% of the total. There's also the Asian Development Bank, but by far and away, and this is a very recent development, by far and away, our debt is to international capital markets. We call these international sovereign bond debt. And that's about 40%, 47% of our total foreign debt. And that really started in about 2009, and that is currently the problem. It is not the bilateral loans, because those can always be renegotiated. But the ISBs, or international sovereign bonds, while they can be renegotiated, these are very, very difficult negotiations. And that is the difficulty we actually face because of this continuous trade imbalance. Now, the question is, why do we have this? And the answer is given in that chart. It's because although we tried, and it was a very brief period that we tried this, we went on an aggressive export-oriented industrialization strategy, and we did manage for 5 years to turn around the trade imbalance. So we actually halved the imbalance. But then new governments coming into power reversed that. They abandoned the export-oriented development strategy. So we basically, if you look at the charts that I was going to present you, we are in the league of sub-Saharan African countries, Latin American countries, and South Asian countries, I think, including India, where we basically have a precarious existence that anytime there is a shock in the world economy, unlike India, you're a very large country and you have access to assets that we don't, we always get into trouble. We always get into trouble. And this is our current situation where we are trying desperately now. One of the things we're trying to do is to argue that going to the IMF is inevitable. We can't stop that because actually the business community, together with the government, is hell-bent on going there, but that is not going to solve our problems in the longer term. We expect to be back to the IMF in the next 3 to 4 years, maybe even sooner, because at least from my perspective, I'm expecting a global crisis this year or early part of next year. And if that is happening, remember, we are really dependent on tourist earnings. If we don't get those tourist earnings, then we're in trouble yet again. And if I read the situation correctly, one of the areas of the world that will be particularly badly affected is the area that we get a lot of our tourists, and that is Europe, Western Europe. I'm guessing that Western Europe will be particularly badly affected by the crisis in Ukraine and the impact on gas and oil prices. So we expect the problem, this recurrent problem, to be not very far away. We expect it to be very close by. So what I have been trying to do is to lobby business groups, trade unions, political parties, professional organizations to embark on this export-oriented industrialization strategy. I was involved in it in the early 1990s, not really in any fundamental way, but because I was setting up the Institute of Policy Studies, a lot of those discussions took place under the umbrella of the Institute of Policy Studies. And so I had a front row seat on what was going on with the industrialization process. And we know it was very, very successful, extremely successful. One of our problems is we have faced a lot of, let's say, blockages from the Western countries. You know, there's almost a continuous attempt to undermine the rationale for export-oriented industrialization. And this has taken many, many forms where people talk about services as the way forward. So, you know, we have been through moments when everyone in Sri Lanka thought we could be a financial hub for India. You know, obviously they never visited Mumbai, but, you know, we had this illusion in our heads that we could be a financial hub. So this now continues even today, that export-oriented industrialization is officially off the agenda, but we're trying to bring that back on the agenda. The second thing that we're trying to avoid, even if we go to the IMF, what we want to do is to try and develop relations with friendly countries to get a line of credit which will limit our need to rely on international sovereign bonds. In other words, we do not want to further indebt ourselves with the international capital markets. So currently, there is a lobby which I'm talking to that want to do business with India, China, Japan, Korea. These are the 4 countries that have been named, but not just to go with a begging bowl to these countries. Rather, what we want to do is to tie up the loans with investments from these countries. And we want to come with a package to show that Sri Lanka is actually open for business. There, my experience, I've been teaching in China since 2000 and in Vietnam since 2012. And I've been watching the experiences of China and Vietnam very, very closely. Also how they have moved in this export-oriented industrialization strategy. And that experience I've also been trying to share with people in Sri Lanka as a way forward for us, without just each and every time going back to the IMF and then going with the begging bowl to other donor countries without actually coming with some business proposals. This is the crucial chart that we have. Can you see this one? You can see the industrializing countries over very long periods, they don't get into deficit. The non-industrializing countries, they do. And then when I add Sri Lanka into that, can you see we're here in this non-industrializing group? And that's why we have recurrent problems, much like all the sub-Saharan African and Latin American countries. And we end up continuously going back to the IMF. And then the case study I give everyone is Vietnam, because they also were in that lower group. And then they switched. They were allowed to switch, and now they're here in the industrializing group. And currently, Vietnam's export value exceeds India's export value. Okay, the dollar value of all Vietnam's exports is now greater than India. It's greater than Brazil. It's greater than nearly all other developing countries, except for China. And they're just roaring away at a very, very rapid pace. So I now leave that. And this is our deindustrialization. Can you see that? We have deindustrialized in Sri Lanka. So manufacturing as a percentage of GDP has just kept falling. And we always tell everyone that all the successful countries have been between 25 and 30% of GDP for 20 years. That's our study. And we have now just simply deindustrialized. We're at 17%, which means there's no industrial dynamism at all left in Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much. That was a little kind of shook us all up, but I'll wait for the reaction. Ramakumar, would you like to make your presentation now?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good evening, Professor Chandhoke, Professor Howard. Thank you for CFA for organizing this and inviting me to speak. My job has become so easy after a very beautiful presentation of what's happening in Sri Lanka now from Professor Howard. I followed his work for quite a while, and it's a great pleasure to be with him on the same panel as well. And that certainly goes for Professor Chandhoke. The crisis in Sri Lanka today, which Professor Howard so well explained, I would not want to repeat what he has already said, but what I shall now try to do is to try to put it in some kind of a broader context, so that we can sort of look at it from a slightly different angle and perspective as well. In my view, there are four important matters to be highlighted when we speak about current Sri Lankan crisis, which is essentially a balance of payments crisis. Let's underline it first. It's not an economic crash or financial sector crash or anything of that sort, but basically we are seeing a serious problem of balance of payments. But this problem has a long history to it, and that's the first point that I would like to make. This is a history of colonialism. This is a history of Sri Lanka's post-independence developmental pattern, and that's one important part of the explanation that I would like to highlight. The second important part that I would like to highlight is the role of the IMF and the role of different neoliberal policies in Sri Lanka, which they have tried to follow over the last 40 to 50 years, and how that has made a problem more complex in the last few decades. The third issue that I would like to highlight is the rise of right-wing authoritarian politics in Sri Lanka, the kind of political regime that it has fostered, and its ramifications. And the fourth point I would like to underline is actually a continuation of the third, but a clear assault on reason, I must say, which happens and which has which has meant that there is a lot of official embrace of pseudoscience, in my view, in the more recent times, which has actually made a bad situation worse. And I'm referring to the experiments in agriculture that has actually led to a kind of food shortage that we are seeing in Sri Lanka today. But none of this is actually mentioned in the mainstream press or mainstream media commentaries of business press and so on. That's only China. That is the important part of the explanation. And the idea is, and everyone, including from some left progressive circles, they would like to borrow from Mike Pence his word, debt trap diplomacy of China being the most important problem. It's an irony that you quote the US Vice President to make a point from the left, but the reality is indeed that the share of Chinese loans, the total foreign debt of Sri Lanka, stands at only around 10%. The largest comes from, as Howard mentioned, international sovereign bonds, ADB, and so on, and Japan, who is actually a bigger lender to Sri Lanka than China. So China is actually either fifth or sixth in the line in terms of total loans, total foreign debt of Sri Lanka. That's number one. Number two is a lot of discussion happens around the Hambantota port and its handing over to China on a 99-year-old lease, a Chinese company on a 99-year-old lease. That also is very skeptic towards it, because in my view, it's a different discussion. China's geopolitical goals, China's strategy to invest in different African, Latin American countries and countries like Sri Lanka, what they do using those investments, that's a different discussion altogether. But the limited point that I would like to make here is that that's certainly not the reason for the balance of payments crisis for Sri Lanka today. The Hambantota port was completely financed by loans close to $1 billion from Chinese Exim Bank, and the port began to run on losses from about 2013 and 14 onwards, and they decided they couldn't finance the losses, so they decided to give it on a lease. And Chinese Merchants Group actually paid $1.2 billion to Sri Lanka while they took over the 99-year-old lease. So the balance of payments problem was actually softened by the Hambantota port transfer and not exacerbated. And a lot of people simply don't get this basic point in economics. Sri Lanka received $1.2 billion in foreign exchange and did not lose it. So the Chinese role comes with a certain agenda, and I think we need to realize that when we read the mainstream press. But let me get back to my 4 points, which is more important for this panel. Sri Lanka had a history of colonialism. Just like many other countries, the cropping pattern was changed by the colonial rulers. Sri Lanka began to cultivate tea, rubber, coconut, spices, etc. And when it became independent in 1948, it was primarily dependent on, like many Latin American countries or many African countries, it was a country dependent primarily on exports of 2 or 3 or 4 primary commodities. And that was the lock-in that Sri Lanka was put into during the colonial rule. And if you take the history of Sri Lanka from 1948 onwards, I don't think it was able to wriggle out of this lock-in of the colonial period. It continues to rely on the exports of tea, coffee, rubber, etc., spices, etc. But a few changes have taken place. Garments could be added to the export basket of Sri Lanka. You could also speak about tourism, and you could also add remittances. So basically, the 1948 phenomenon of export of primary commodities plus garment exports plus tourism plus remittances, that more or less captures the Sri Lankan economy of today. I mean, I'm being a little crude and superficial here. I'm aware things are a bit more complex, but if you look at it from the top, you basically see that Sri Lanka has very little diversification of its productive base over the years, and that has meant that, as Professor Howard mentioned, it has been extremely vulnerable to all kinds of external shocks. Any decline in the international economy, which sort of negatively impacts its import of primary commodities or any other commodity, or jobs abroad, the Sri Lankan diaspora, the shock is immediately transmitted to the Sri Lankan economy through a balance of payments problem, because it leads to a fall of foreign exchange. So this is one important, the vulnerability to shocks, external shocks, has been a very persistent feature of Sri Lankan economy and society from 1948 onwards, and its inability to diversify its productive base in the global capitalist system that we have is one important contextual point that we need to underline at this point of time. Now, all efforts by Sri Lanka from the 1960s onwards, and that's my second point related to IMF, all efforts by Sri Lanka to indeed invest more or try to diversify its economic base, etc., were in many senses frustrated by the 16 IMF loans that it took between 1965 and 2016, and the conditionalities that it had imposed on Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's first loan from IMF was in 1965, when, after the Korean War induced rise in commodity prices of the 1950s, commodity prices began to fall in the 1960s, and then it had to go to the IMF for the first time. But then the key point to sort of mention here is also the catapulting of Sri Lanka into a status of what we call in India as the Kerala model and so on. That is, achievement of high level of social sector indicators, even at very low per capita incomes. So Sri Lanka became known, along with Kerala or other countries like Kenya or Costa Rica or Cuba, etc., where this phenomenon was achieved in the early phases of development itself. And partly this was funded by the income from commodity exports in the 1950s. And this also went into trouble, went into a crisis. The investments or the expenditures that were required in the social sector could not be retained because of different IMF conditionalities that came from the 1970s onwards. I say 1970s because there's 1977 Sri Lankan loan from the IMF was indeed the opening of the door for an intense phase of neoliberalism in Sri Lanka. It led to enormous adverse impact on its social sector achievements, and it took a lot of time for Sri Lanka to actually come out of it. And this is also the time, and that's where I come to the to sort of consolidate my second point. The IMF loans and its conditionalities primarily related to inability of Sri Lanka to expand its budget deficit, inability of Sri Lanka to raise its tax rates and spend for the people, etc. It stymied its efforts to diversify, to expand public investment, expand public expenditure, and diversify the productive base of the economy. And the IMF loan phenomenon has been extremely adverse for the Sri Lankan economy from that perspective. The third point, and I think I would like to start from the IMF point itself when I talk about the third point, the rise of right-wing authoritarian politics in Sri Lanka, which basically began with the enormous protests that Sri Lanka saw between 1977 and 1983, subsequent to the intensive IMF loan package of 1977, when Jayawardene became the president. The parliamentary system became a presidential system. There was a huge onslaught on left movements and trade unions who protested against the IMF package of 1977. And this was also the time that Jayawardene inaugurated a phase of cultural chauvinism from a majoritarian perspective. This was the time when attacks on Tamil minorities began. And then things get very complex. It's difficult to point out who is right and who is wrong. It culminates in the July 1983 pogrom of Sri Lanka, of Sri Lankan Tamils, which inaugurates the civil war of 26 years between 1983 and 2009. And this, of course, is another phase of frustration for the Sri Lankan economy, where all momentums of growth, all possibilities of a unified society which could sort of come together to support the process of growth and development are actually weakened. And this solidifies the growth and development of right-wing politics, culminates in 2005 with the coming to power of Mahinda Rajapaksa, and who sort of brutally suppresses the civil war by 2009, which has its own implications. But by 2009, he declares that he is beginning a process of rejuvenating the economy. And how does he do that? He goes to IMF yet again for another $2.5 billion loan. And that again comes with its own conditionalities in the sense that fiscal deficit cannot exceed 5% by 2011, and monetary policy has to be tightened. You have to control your credit supply. You have to follow inflation targeting. Foreign investments have to be promoted. All these conditional, usual, predictable IMF conditionalities come with the 2009 loan as well. So this sort of phase that begins in 2009 is initially successful, because commodity prices are still rising till about 2011 or 12. But by 2012 onwards, commodity prices start falling again globally, and Sri Lanka is again affected by this price decline. What we see here is that from 2012 onwards, GDP growths begin to fall, investment rates fall, savings rates fall, exports to GDP fall, and the balance of payments problem slowly begins to intensify. And by 2015, you have another blowing up of the balance of payments problem. Mahinda Rajapaksa goes out, his ally for a long time, Maithripala Sirisena, becomes the president in 2015-16, and then in 2016, Maithripala Sirisena goes again to the IMF for the 16th loan of, I think, if I remember correctly, about 1.6 billion US dollars. Now, here again, you start one more round of conditionality and its implementation. You are asked to reduce your fiscal deficit to about 4 to 4.5% by 2019 and 3.5% by 2020. Monetary policy has to be tightened, inflation has to be targeted, etc., etc. So with the point, that's the third point that I was trying to make. That is the rise of authoritarian politics, which began in about the late 70s and early 80s. It was associated on the one hand with a suppression of left movements and trade unions. It was associated with the rise of communal violence, as you would call it today, the beginning of the Civil War, the rise of cultural chauvinism, etc. And it also embraces neoliberalism in a very intensive way. So you actually see a convergence of neoliberalism with a very divisive ideology, and both sit very comfortably with each other throughout this 20 to 30-year-old period. There is absolutely no qualm about going to the IMF and taking a very contractionary economic package, a loan package from them, and most right-wing parties are completely joined in that effort. Now, this 2016 IMF package leads to further negative developments in the Sri Lankan economy. Growth rates continue to fall. The balance of payments problem does not in any form get ameliorated. And by 2019, a few other factors chip in, and which makes the situation even more complicated. By 2019, April, you have the Easter bombings in Colombo, where luxury hotels and churches were targeted. 253 people or so were killed, which leads to a huge fall in tourist revenues, which was by then an important backbone of the Sri Lankan economy, along with commodity exports. So on yearly basis, I think tourist arrivals fall by about 20%, but in the May, June, July months actually see this falling by 60-70%. So it leads to an enormous impact on foreign exchange earnings of Sri Lanka, which is in some sense the reason, also, maybe proximately, but other reasons are there as well, for the coming back of the Rajapaksa family in the elections of 2019 November. I think they come to power in November and December, and they actually go into a huge populist spree in the election manifesto. They actually agree, they actually tell the people that if we come to power, we are going to reduce taxes drastically, which will lead to a sort of rejuvenation of the economy. We would actually give more and more sops to farmers. We will, in fact, Rajapaksa said that we will give more and more foreign fertilizers to you at a lower price. That was one of the promises that he had given during the election campaign. So they come to power, and in December 2019 itself, they cut taxes drastically. Even IMF is amused at this kind of tax cut that Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa this time implements, VAT rates are cut from 15% to 8%. In the lower the thresholds for payment of tax for VAT and income tax, etc., are raised drastically. Corporate taxes are reduced from 28% to 24%, and this leads to if one of the watchdogs of public finance in Sri Lanka point out that there is a fall of registered taxpayers by about 33.5% as a result of these tax cuts and the raising of payment thresholds. So your foreign exchange is already coming down. Your reserves are actually under great stress, and add to that you have this problem of tax cuts and falling tax revenues of the government. Now all this, the bad situation gets really worse, and then it gets really into a collapsing mode with COVID, where there are absolutely no tourists coming, and exports of tea, coffee, rubber, etc., are also affected, and Sri Lanka enters into a period of intensified crisis. I have about a minute and a half more to end my 20 minutes. So I'll get in my fourth point very quickly, and I will complete.
You have about 10 minutes more. Carry on.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you. But the fourth phase that I'm talking about is at this point of time, Rajapaksa receives the advice that about $400 million are annually spent on fertilizer imports into our country. And if we could actually completely stop the imports of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, you could actually save that foreign exchange. Now, this is a very controversial topic in Sri Lanka and globally as well today, because it is completely unsure who advised Rajapaksa to take this kind of a drastic step and declare Sri Lanka to be 100% organic farming nation overnight, much like the shock and awe demonetization of India in 2016 November. You have this policy where in April it is announced that from 10th of May onwards, all imports of chemicals are completely going to be stopped. And this story is very interesting to the kind of people who, if you have people like Anil Bokil and different chartered accountants who advised Narendra Modi on demonetization, you have a similar set of rather shady characters advising Gotabaya Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka as well. So you have one guy who basically says that I have discovered a rice which fed the kings of the Anuradhapura kingdom in the BC period, and I have rediscovered it. And agricultural scientists went and examined that what he had claimed to be rice, and they found it was not rice at all. It was actually sorghum, right? And it is this kind of characters who, and I think somebody else said, if you put pesticides, the buns will get dissolved and so on. So all kinds of shady characters with zero scientific expertise were advising him at this point of time. And all the agricultural scientists, serious agricultural scientists, were kept away from the task forces and so on. In fact, those who protested were actually kicked out as well as it went by. So they had actually said that, look, don't do this. There is something that is validated in agricultural science, which is called good agricultural practices, GAP, and also which leads to safe to eat food, which essentially means that you do not overuse chemicals in agriculture. You sort of have a scientific effort to actually calibrate the use of chemicals and fertilizers in such a way that it does not pollute the environment, even as it does not lead to a fall in productivity. So this kind of advice was given, but then at that point of time, Rajapaksa's key goal was to reduce the pressure on foreign exchange. So he went in for the shock and awe. He went in for the hyperbole, as they say, and banned everything completely. And this simply made a really I'm running out of adjectives now. I said bad became worse, worse became collapse, and I don't know what to say now. I don't have a word for the next phase, but it becomes really bad with this. And the first season is the Yala season is saved a little bit because the imports of fertilizers have already taken place. But the Maha season, which began in October, November, was very badly affected, and reports indicate that about 40 to 45% fall in productivity of paddy has taken place. 20 to 30% fall in the productivity of tea, rubber, etc. have taken place. And what this has done is ironic in the sense that this was implemented to reduce the pressure on foreign exchange. And what it actually ended up doing was that it reduced the productivity of paddy, which meant that by 2019, Sri Lanka was actually self-sufficient in paddy production. That was actually, agricultural scientists in Sri Lanka claim it as a huge success of their national agricultural research system. They had become self-sufficient in rice production by 2019, but they are now to a situation where they are close to importing 40 to 50% of their annual rice requirement from abroad. So from self-sufficiency, you're going to 40 to 50% foreign dependence on basic food grains like rice. Now, this means you have to import more. That means you have to spend more foreign exchange for those imports. But that same very foreign exchange reserves are reduced by the same policy, which actually reduced the productivity of tea, rubber, coconut also, which meant that you had much less to export and earn foreign exchange on. So you basically ended up earning less foreign exchange because your productivity fell in tea, rubber, coffee, etc. And you actually had to import more of paddy because the productivity fell because of the same policy. So ironically, you have this embrace of pseudoscience. That's my fourth point. This embrace of pseudoscience has led to an exacerbation of the problems, which has led to huge food shortage. Inflation hit about 70 to 18% in February and March, and the hardships of people have only multiplied as a result. So, so this is where I sort of would like to end my presentation. History matters. The disastrous impact of IMF's neoliberal policies matter. The emergence of right-wing authoritarian politics, which later leads to some kind of a brand of right-wing populism, mirroring much in India, happens there as well. And then finally, the embrace of pseudoscience. And one of the things that is interesting about this panel discussion is that there is something called lessons for India. And I think all of these are lessons for India as well, except the history part where Indian economy is a little more diversified. It's not dependent on foreign exchange as Sri Lanka is, or on the export of a few primary commodities. It's much more industrialized than other countries. It has a much diversified basket. It's rich in foreign exchange reserves because of software exports, remittances, and so on. So the conditions are very different. But certain the impacts of neoliberal policies, the emergence of right-wing authoritarian politics, and the embrace of pseudoscience. All these are parallels that you see in India and Sri Lanka, which does not look good in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramakumar. We've had two very fascinating presentations. The first one by Howard was so clear and so concise that it makes sense even to me, who's a non-economist. And Ramakumar kind of contextualizes the entire argument that Howard had made. And it's very, very interesting. I just have a couple of points before we throw the two presentations open for discussion. You know what, as I said, I'm no economist. I happen to be a political theorist, but reading about Sri Lanka in the newspapers, I almost felt that it was a classic case of what in the 1980s and 1990s were called IMF conditionalities and the protest movements that it had generated all over South America and Sub-Saharan Africa. You obviously, and the worry is that the IMF is now going to bail out Sri Lanka at the expense of several very stringent austerity conditions. And we all know what happens when austerity conditions are imposed by the IMF, because you have unemployment, you have a rollback of the state from social sector provisioning. And that will be a pity, because quite right, along with Kerala, Sri Lanka is seen as a country that did manage to provide basic services to its people, health, education, etc. So that is my fear, that we're basically going to see the effect of IMF conditionalities being reverberating on the lives of the employed and the unemployed. And of course, trade unions are in a bad shape all over the world. The third point, which has a lot of commonality with the rest of the world, is how the austerity conditions imposed by the IMF have thrown up, and globalization have thrown up, populist leaderships, authoritarian leaderships, which adopt populist measures, but that I'll come to in a moment, Now, what strikes me is from both these presentations is how authoritarian leaders are financially completely incompetent. The degree of incompetence, and I like that comment made by Ramakumar about the shady advisors they had, because in the caravan of, I think, a month ago, there's a cover story of how Modi's doctors actually helped obfuscate the seriousness of the situation during COVID. And the same thing, the subordination of science to superstition and indigenous methods, indigenous history was so very obvious that it was scary. It took me about 2 hours to read that piece. And this is obviously what happened in Sri Lanka right from Jayawardene. Now, the fourth point is how all authoritarian leaders are incapable of justifying their own rule except by creating ethnic war, as happened in Sri Lanka and as is happening in India today. Populist measure, they're not creating employment, they're giving away money. I mean, I can't understand what's happening. Why don't you, Marxism, the basic lesson we learned that it's important for people to earn their own living because that gives to them a sense of dignity. Now, they're not interested in increasing employment. They're interested in just giving away money or giving away subsidies. This leads to a balance of payment crisis, and this leads to, of course, the financial imbroglio that we see today. The diversion of energies of the people into such kind of modes, all in an attempt to legitimize authoritarian rulers, is what is truly frightening. The complete lack of legitimacy that they would that they would suffer from if they didn't resort to whipping up ethnic sentiments and dividing their people, and also kind of channelizing. You make everybody into a consumer rather than a citizen, because the consumer is dependent upon you. And we saw this in the case of India in the UP elections, where food was given out, food grains were given out with the photograph of the Prime Minister. And as a political theatre, I mean, this is their right for the state to provide them with the basic preconditions, rather than as alms to be given by a charitable organization. But that is the discourse of citizenship has been set on its head. And of course, the Easter bombings, the whipping up of ethnic hate, the kind of atrocities that were inflicted upon the Tamilians, and now the monopoly of the political system by the Rajapaksa family is so familiar in South Asia, and it's actually very frightening. But I'm going to stop here and ask for questions, because both these presentations have raised enormously important issues about policy prescriptions, but also about the inability of certain elites to diversify their economy and rely upon primary products, and which are, of course, susceptible to the vicissitudes of the market. I have to add that I did my PhD on Zimbabwe, and I used to teach courses on African politics, and country after country, how it was manipulated by international organizations. Tanzania could never grow coffee. And even Zambia, which produced copper, was completely subordinated to the international economy and multinationals. So it is a very frightening scenario. And what is the way out? I hope both of you would be able to suggest. I know Howard did suggest that how do you pay the balance of payment crisis? How do you meet the balance of payment crisis? How do you pay back the debt? I hope that Sri Lanka doesn't land up paying interest on interest, as has happened in the rest of the developing world. I think Sunanda Sen has raised her hand. Sunanda, would you like to comment?
One thing is that, Howard, when you speak about the possibility of industrializing export-oriented countries doing better, which has happened, of course, apart from China, Vietnam is an example. Now, I hope in your mind, you are excluding the Western Europe as destination, because, they are in a mess, as we all know. Therefore, it is the South-South trade which probably will lend some benefits to the export orientation. Now, the related thing is, now Sri Lanka, as far as I know, it relies on, sorry, I have to go to another room. Sri Lanka relies on tourism and on commodity exports like tea, coffee, rubber. Okay. Now, who controls the production of these commodities? Is there any corporate control over? Because in many countries, especially in Latin America, the commodities, I mean, we all know how there has been commercialization, how the corporates have sort of taken care, not just taken care, but they are controlling the production, the pricing, and so on. So is it that? The second question is about debt. You have mentioned, which is very revealing, that is China is not the largest creditor in relation to Sri Lanka. Now, but a lot is being written now in newspapers and so on about the debt redemption and how the debt can be redeemed by the major countries like China. Well, I find it a bit mysterious, because if ISBs, if the international sovereign bonds are the major thing, then well, debt is not so important. Then the last question, I'll just stop. The last question is that, when you talk about the ISBs, when they sold it, I think their credit rating was not that bad. But today they cannot. Therefore, they have to go to IMF and so on. But, even today, the rating of the ISBs will be quite important when they pay back. And in this context, the exchange rate does matter. The currency does matter. And what is happening to that? So, thank you.
Thank you. Howard, I think you have 2 questions on chat box. If you could just take a look. In the meantime, and if by the time he reads those, a very complex first question, and the second one is, what is the alternative to industrialization-led exports? Does anybody else want to say anything by the time he formulates a response?
I have
yes, please.
a response already, Neera, and that is, I personally don't see an alternative to export-oriented industrialization, given Sri Lanka's size and limited domestic market. I mean, if one is talking about India, you have a reasonable domestic market, but even for you, I would still say that there is a role for export-oriented industrialization. As we have seen with China having such a large population, still, the fundamental basis for their success has been this export-oriented industrialization. So Sri Lanka has had this experience, and we've been very successful in a limited period of time. And that was the period of time from 1991 right through till 94. And the benefits of that continued right up to 2000. The trajectory that we saw from 95 to 2000 was laid in that period, 91 to 94. Now, what is important to note there is we actually had a civil war in the north and a civil war in the south of the country. And in spite of that, our growth rates actually have never been higher. And that is because we had a president that actually had his back to the wall, and he had no choice but to go for a very imaginative export-oriented industrialization strategy. And that was what we call in Sri Lanka the 200 garments factory effort. Now, it wasn't just garments. What happened at the latter part of his regime was that we started to get manufacturers in all different areas, especially electronics, starting to come in, because the incentive structure was so favorable to export-oriented manufacturers. However, when the president was killed and a new regime came in, they again went to the IMF. And what we saw was really an aggressive blockage of that strategy. What the IMF did in that period was really dismantle a lot of the incentives that we had for this strategy. And it's curious because it was at a time of a regime where the president actually called herself a Marxist-Leninist, and she relied heavily on the IMF and people who were sympathetic to the IMF in terms of their economic policies. And they systematically dismantled our export-oriented strategy. We were never able to recapture that after that. Someone then asked a related question, and I think it was something like, are there any other sectors? But I may have misread that, sorry. I just wanted to come back to what Sunanda said, because it's an important point, and we've been discussing this a number of times in recent days, and that is Sri Lanka's link to the India Free Trade Association, to the China Free Trade Association. Now we have a free trade link with India, the SAARC, but we don't have one with China. And there is a lot of discussion about us joining the Chinese Free Trade Association because it gives us the possibility to have investors who want to access that free trade association coming to Sri Lanka and using Sri Lanka as a base. And we're particularly thinking of Indian corporations who might want to access the Chinese free trade area by using Sri Lanka as a base. So there's been this extensive discussion. From my perspective, I actually see that East Asia has now become the center of the world economy. They dominate global manufacturing by far, and anything that happens to East Asia affects the whole world. I've seen recently the OECD has the lead indicator for the state of the world economy, actually the Chinese manufacturing sector. But I would go one further and say, if you take East Asia as a block and you use that as the lead indicator, it's almost perfect. Whatever happens to East Asia happens to the rest of the world, basically because it accounts for about 60% of global manufactures. For me, this means to say that Sri Lanka should stop looking to the West and should start looking to the East, and concentrate a lot of our investment efforts attracting corporations from East Asia. Because historically, we keep turning to the West for everything, including tourists. But actually, if we spent a bit more time attracting Chinese tourists, we'd be far better off than we are just concentrating on Western European tourists. So it's an important question that Sunanda raised because it's currently being discussed extensively. And that's where the propaganda element comes in, Ramakumar, that you mentioned this, that everyone says that Sri Lanka is in a Chinese debt trap. And we shouldn't have more to do with China because, we're actually being strangled by China, which is actually untrue. If you look at it dispassionately, we're not strangled by China, far from it. And there is a lot of scope for us to have a more cooperative relationship. One of the things that I am disturbed about is we keep going with the begging bowl to everybody. So it's this discussion we constantly have, well, who do we go with the begging bowl to? India, China, the West? And my argument is don't do that. Try and set up business partnerships in that context. Change the whole strategy and don't go just with a begging bowl, go with a business proposition. And I learned that from Vietnam. That they did something really interesting, intriguing, in fact. In 2012, they aggressively pursued Samsung Electronics. And why? Because Samsung has the technology they wanted to acquire. Samsung has global market access. And Samsung dominates the political scene in Korea. So shortly after Samsung entered Vietnam in a massive investment, suddenly you start to see the Korean government coming in with infrastructure projects for Vietnam on a highly concessional basis, because they see their vested interest now developing the manufacturing base of Vietnam and the infrastructure to facilitate their own investments there. And now they've done the same thing with the Japanese. And the Japanese government is now metro system in Saigon, in Ho Chi Minh City. And similarly, the Japanese government is also providing the metro system in Hanoi. Why? Because the Vietnamese are doing a lot of work with the Japanese car companies now. So for me, they have a different strategy. They try and cement the business relationships and use those relationships to attract longer-term concessional finance, which actually, as far as Samsung and the various car companies from Japan are concerned, is actually feathering their nests in Vietnam. You know, it's actually benefiting them as well. So for me, this is a very important thing that we have learned from them, and we still haven't operationalized it in Sri Lanka. You know, this begging bowl mentality is still there, which today we had this discussion where somebody said, you know, there's all this corruption going on with a lot of these aid projects. Of course there is. Of course there is. Because if that's all you're doing, then you're going to get suckered, you know, and everyone is going to cream off percentages from all those projects. But if it is strongly linked to business partnerships, that is less likely to happen, in my view.
Yeah, thank you, Howard. Okay, Ramakumar, you have about 3 questions on organic farming. So would you like to take them? And
yeah, just before that, I think there was one or two questions from Professor Sunanda Sen as well. Yes, increasingly you do see the trend that Sri Lankan Sri Lankan primary exports are controlled increasingly by larger corporate firms, and that's indeed the case. And more recently, many of these firms are also linked kinship-wise or otherwise to the Rajapaksa family, and so that kind of cronyism is also on full display in many of the export deals and import deals that Sri Lanka is entering into more recently. The other question, before I come to the organic point, the questions of debt redemption and all were also raised, and I would like to sort of listening to Professor Howard was extremely educative, but I would like to sort of add a point there, which is that the begging bowl problem is there because the economy is reduced to a serious, painted into a corner, may I say, thanks to this balance of payments crisis. I completely see that happening. But this whole geopolitical fracas that is actually spreading across South Asia, including the Chinese part of the region, is actually endangering all kinds of unified efforts to help either Pakistan or Sri Lanka. And Pakistan is yet another country which is right up there with the 13th IMF loan, and it's sort of negotiating for the 14th. I think in all these regions, there's of course a history that South Asia has. If you take Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or India or Pakistan or Nepal, you do see a certain trajectory. And India is the only country probably which has sort of a little bit diversified out of the old kind of lock-in. But if you want to sort of a real sort of may I say a genuine help for Sri Lanka at this time of crisis, it requires a unified effort. Sri Lanka will have to go to the IMF for a small loan with few conditionalities, I accept, But I think China and India have to make a unified step into this situation and help Sri Lanka out of this crisis. That's the only way out of this. But then what is endangering this unified effort is actually vested interests, which focus on China in a very exaggerated form, try to play up tensions between India and China and make it look like two grooms vying for a bride kind of a story. And this sort of this kind of geopolitical tensions and their continued lingering on is actually going to be a serious constraint in making a unified effort to help Sri Lanka. I've not formulated it quite well in my head, but that's roughly what I wanted to say on that front. Now, the organic point. I come from a very different perspective, partly because of my training, because I've trained in agricultural science as well. The policy was, of course, stupid, that you decide in 1 month that I'm going to move into 100% organic next month. There's no doubt about it. But the point here is, I think there's a larger debate that people on the left and progressive movements have to undertake among themselves. How are you going to position agriculture in the era of climate change? Is it going to be the path of science, or is it going to be a path of rejection of science? And I would think that we follow the path of science. And that path of science tells us that you do not need drastic measures of the kind that Sri Lanka tried in order to reduce chemical use in agriculture. Agricultural science is deeply advanced in the modern times, and you know now of many solutions which can effectively reduce the use of chemicals in agriculture, even as they do not lead to a fall of productivity. Let's not quarrel over the fact that organic farming leads to a fall of productivity. It does. It is globally well proven. But what saves organic farming here is the premium prices that the farmers receive for these products, which sort of more than compensates sometimes for the fall of productivity. Now, if a set of farmers want to go on that path and to harvest the benefits of those benefits out there from the premium price, they should go in and do that. But that cannot be the policy for a whole country where mass consumption of food grains is the challenge in front of you. And in that situation, a rise of productivity, or at least letting productivity not fall, is an important public policy objective that we must keep close to our chest. And that means that we should, following the path of science here primarily means that there are multiple solutions now available, whereby you can increase the fertilizer use efficiency from 35% of now to about 65 to 70% of tomorrow. And that you can do by using different inhibitors. You can use fertigation techniques. You can use nanotechnology, etc. Look at, for example, a seed which comes coated, a nano coating of fertilizers and nutrients with it. In an ordinary seed, you will have to apply fertilizers in 15 days after sowing. But if you use this nano seed, you need not apply any external fertilizers for 45 days. These technologies are today available from our agricultural universities in the public domain, not corporate domain. But where is our public policy using all these innovations? Where is our public policy making use of these scientific innovations and allowing them to expand on a mass scale in India's agricultural fields? That policy objective is simply not there. In India as well, what you see is an exact replica of that policy. Even though we have not banned the chemical fertilizers and so on, we are saying zero budget natural farming is the solution, where cow dung and cow urine can play the role of NPK fertilizers. No person with any sense of rationality will accept that as a reasonable proposition, because it simply doesn't provide that kind of nutrients to the plants, and productivity will fall. There's no doubt about it. And the question is, how do you compensate the farmers? Are you ready to spend that kind of amount as compensation to the farmers? Or are you going to embrace the path of science to have a calibrated policy over the next 20 years to reduce the chemical fertilizers and pesticide use in agriculture and move to a net zero status by 2070? That's the question that we all have in mind. So let's not defend the indefensible in Sri Lanka. That was well pointed out by agricultural scientists. Agricultural scientists do not say use fertilizers and chemicals indiscriminately. They argue for GAP, good agricultural practices. And that's the path of science which we should follow. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Anirban, can I hand over the proceedings to you?
Thanks, Neera, and thanks to both Professor Howard and Professor Ramakumar for a really enlightening session. Though there are some questions that we couldn't address, but most of the questions have been addressed by both speakers, and I think it was quite an enriching conversation that we had today. I think over the course of the last more than an hour, we have not only covered the long shadow of history that lies behind the crisis in Sri Lanka, but also looked forward to some of the possible alternatives to going with the begging bowl every time to IMF, and what also covered the possible ramifications that we have seen of that in Sri Lanka, and also we spoke of that in the context of India and what it entails. Of course, this is a discussion that can go on for a long time. There may be many sessions. There are too many things that can be unfolded. One of the things that we were actually wondering is that no country helps the other without an interest. And over here, we do. There already has been questions being raised in Sri Lanka about the crisis being leveraged to give undue advantages to Adani, say for instance. So there are too many of those complexities, but we have no time to get into those. But I think we have covered a fairly long distance and also depth in the course of the conversations. We also see that coming from different vantage points, the speakers kind of agreed with each other on most points, and that kind of gives us also a sense of direction as to where to look towards. So thank you so much again. I wouldn't be holding off this for too long, and we will keep you posted for further discussions that we have, as we call it, Economy Pe Charcha.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.